low here. Come on out, kids. The water's fine.
Robin's here. Going independent.
Welcome to the wonderful world of space.
Welcome to the start of Season 5 of Ancient DOS Games, everyone. I decided to kick things off with a game which came as somewhat of a surprise to me, but not for good reasons. That game being The Dig. This is actually a highly requested game, and my initial research showed that a lot of people enjoyed it, and that it did things very differently to a typical LucasArts adventure title. So I was expecting something phenomenal, which is why I planned to begin the year with this one, but I don't know. This game left me with a lot of mixed feelings. So here's the thing. The Dig is incredibly atmospheric with an extraordinarily well done and fitting soundtrack, combined with very imaginative and otherworldly graphics, many of which were done using 3D rendering software. It has this feel that you're really going through some strange ancient alien world unlike anything anyone's ever imagined. But that's not exactly a good thing. This is supposed to be a game, but feels more like work trying to get through it because as the player, you're faced with the same lack of information about the puzzles as the protagonists. And given that so much of what you find has no clear and obvious purpose, combined with some interface snafus, you can end up scratching your head for hours on puzzles which really aren't even remotely difficult had you known what the mechanics were or at least what the end goal was. I also had a heck of a time trying to get this thing working in DOSBox, as I have the Steam release of the game and not an actual physical copy. But there was indeed a way to get it working that way, so I'll fill you all in on how to do it at the end of the episode.
A bunch of displays set into the walls. Inscriptions here and there. I'd say it looks like some kind of museum.
The Dig actually got its start in 1989, but it remained in development for several years before LucasArts finally managed to get it out the door in 1995. It's a one-player inventory-based adventure game with support for VGA 320x200 256 color graphics and a decent range of audio devices. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, but available in a couple of ways. I happen to have the Steam release, available from store.steampowered.com, and although I got it super cheap over the holidays, the regular price is $5. You can also get it for $6 from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com. Now, so long as you're willing to do some hex editing, I recommend the Steam release, as you have more options as to how you run it, but if you just want it to up and work as best as possible without having to fiddle with things then I would recommend the GOG release. I'll go more into depth into why this is later. Your other option is to go hunting for a physical release, which, despite the short name, is surprisingly easy to do. Though be warned that some people feel this game is super ultra rare and worth hundreds of dollars. Really, for the game disc alone, you shouldn't be spending more than $5 or so. Fully boxed tends to go for anywhere between $20 and $50, while there's also a re-release which comes in a box similar to DVD cases, even though it's a CD, not a DVD, which is actually quite common for LucasArts adventure titles, and those ones go for around $10. So, before we talk about the story in the game, let's quickly answer a related question Matthew Belchin sent in, where he asks, I could be wrong, but I swore I read at one time in a PC Gamer magazine that this game was intended to be a movie by Steven Spielberg, but was turned into a game instead? Well, the answer is yes. Technically. And what Steven Spielberg had originally envisioned back in '89 when development started on this game was a fair bit different than how this game ultimately turned out. In fact, his original plan was to make his idea into an episode for his Amazing Stories television series, but he ultimately realized it would have been far too expensive to produce. So instead, he passed the idea along to LucasArts to turn it into a game, figuring that would be cheaper and easier to do. Little did anyone realize just how tumultuous, long, and expensive the development process for this game was going to ultimately turn out to be. As for the story we ended up getting, it starts off at a tracking station on Earth, where everything seems to be as boring as usual, until a blip actually appears on one of the scanners. Apparently, a 5-mile wide asteroid several weeks away from the planet somehow changed course all on its own and was now heading straight for a collision with Earth. given what little tech we had in the 90s for space travel, let alone dealing with asteroids, a plan is hatched, and NASA sends 5 people up into space to use a pair of nuclear devices to alter the asteroid's trajectory and put it into orbit as a second moon, since it's too close to blast apart and it's already caught in Earth's gravitational pull. However, the leader of the mission and the game's main protagonist, Boston Lowe, was given a secondary mission to investigate the asteroid for signs of an alien intelligence, given what the asteroid did to even threaten Earth in the first place. The team finds this evidence very quickly, and soon after, 3 of the 5 team members, including Boston, find their way inside the asteroid, end up triggering something, and are sent on a journey clear across the universe, bringing them to a strange alien world with a surprisingly breathable atmosphere. With few supplies, no contact with Earth, and no idea where in the cosmos they are, Boston and the others are faced with a blatantly simple task: survive. Now, it should be said that the story in this game doesn't really hold up all that well for a couple of reasons. The first is that the voice acting is surprisingly subpar, but not through any fault of the voice actors themselves. They all read their lines fairly well, but it's as though none of them were told where any of the emphasis was supposed to be, and all of them have this strange thing going on where their inflections don't match the situation, suggesting they weren't actually given any proper context for any of the lines they were reading. The other issue I have with the story is just the main characters in general. Not a single one of them is likable, and each of them just seems to thrive on conflict. Now, things get a little better between Boston and the female lead Maggie Robbins much later in the story, but it feels less like them understanding each other and more just a sudden shift in their attitudes. The other main character, Ludger Brink, goes through some significant personality changes as the story progresses, so judging their character based on those actions would be somewhat unfair. But until those changes begin, he still acts like a power-hungry cretin anyways, so he was already unlikable right from the start, just like everyone else. Ironically, there's only a tiny number of instances where conversation advances the plot, so if you don't want to listen to these characters spout surprisingly rude or condescending stuff at each other, you can just skip talking to anyone 99% of the time. Most anything anyone says is irrelevant to actually solving the game's puzzles anyways.
Fantastic! Look!
Now, before we go on, I feel I should point something out. This game was originally being built with what was going to be a successor to the LucasArts Scum system, dubbed Story Droid, which is going to have far enhanced graphical and audio features compared to what Scum was originally capable of. But due to all the delays and rewrites this game had, it was changed at the last minute to use the then current iteration of Scum. And I'm going to guess it was because Story Droid's development had likely fallen behind that of Scum over the course of the 6 years this game was in development for, given that nothing else LucasArts was working on used Story Droid. For those with the technical know-how, you can still see some remnants of Story Droid's presence in how the game data is organized inside its script files. The reason this is relevant is because of how the game actually plays. Unlike most point-and-click adventure titles, you don't have a list of actions you can perform. Anytime you click on something, your character will perform whatever action makes the most sense. Thus, if you click on a person, you talk to them. If you click on a door, you try to open it. If you click on a switch, you go and use it. To actually look at something, you have to right-click to go into your inventory and select the magnifying glass in the top left, then use that the same way you'd use an item. Now, accessing the inventory is a bit weird. There's a button in the bottom left corner of the screen which brings it up, but you can also use the right mouse button. Seems normal enough, right? Well, what's weird is that there's nearly a full second delay between clicking to access the inventory and the inventory actually showing up, with the game still functioning as normal while this delay is in effect. This can create some odd situations where you'll try to access your inventory, move your mouse to click on something by instinct, click, but because the inventory hasn't shown up yet, you end up clicking on something in the game world instead, and end up canceling the inventory from showing up at all. Also, the button at the bottom left may look tiny, but there's actually a massive amount of space around it which all counts as clicking that button, which can make it tricky to leave some screens, as the exit to the screen may sometimes be right where that inventory access is handled. Though all that said, I did notice when testing the game in Scum VM that the delay is considerably reduced there by comparison to running it in DOSBox. The conversation system is also a little unusual. Whenever you converse with someone, you have three options by default. The ability to ask a question, the ability to, quote, say something profound, and a button to exit the conversation, since the normal rules of clearing things from the screen don't apply while in a conversation. You also have more options depending on which topics are available with that individual. Now, while this is kind of quirky for sure, it's only minor nitpicking compared to two of the major issues present with conversing with people. The first major issue is that the system will make an icon blue if there's nothing more to learn on a particular topic, which is all well and good, except that if you close off a conversation with someone, the states of these topics are also reset. So what should have been an excellent feature for keeping the player informed as to what they may still learn through conversation later in time, instead becomes completely pointless, since there's no simple way to track if these topics will reveal new info or just repeat the same things you've already heard. The second major issue is, just like with every LucasArts adventure game I've played up to now, they don't make it obvious how to skip dialogue. Instead of using a blatantly obvious key or just letting the player click through, to skip a line of dialogue, you have to push the period key. I mean, really, the period key? I couldn't figure this out on my own while playing through, and ended up making one of the puzzles borderline insane, because it involved having to talk with Maggie about a particular stone tablet. And every time you talk to her about it, you get the same minute worth of dialogue, except in one very specific location. And since you don't know where that location is, if you don't know how to skip dialogue, you're forced to listen to that entire minute over and over and over and over again while continually trying to find the right location to ask her about that tablet in. In fact, there's some major issues with the puzzle design in general. Again, this stems from the fact that the game is trying to come across as this otherworldly exploration, but in making the player feel so isolated with no real-world concepts to latch onto or hints as to what they should even be doing in the first place, actually accomplishing the puzzles feels more like work than like fun, especially given how unorthodox many of them are. For instance, one puzzle involves these crystals. 4 of them are lit up, and 1 is not, so you have to find a way to light them all. Now, until you have a particular item you need to interact with this puzzle, clicking on the crystals simply gives you some dialogue. So this makes the player assume that the crystals don't actually do anything, and that the puzzle is focused on the holes, since the item you need fits cleanly into one of the holes, then causes all 3 to have these rods which can slide up and down. The game even has special icons for the mouse to let you know that you can slide them up and down. But as you do this, there's 0 feedback, so you're left wondering if you're even doing it right or if there's some special combination you're missing or something. This can go on for quite a while, until out of the blue you go to click on one of the crystals, which you were convinced simply gave you dialogue, only to suddenly find you turned it off. And then with a bit more effort, you finally figure out that you have to select crystals to modify, and then modify their state by sliding the rods. This kind of user-hostile approach is found in a lot of the puzzles with this game. As another example, here's a carcass with a bunch of bones scattered around. Now, when I first went to this screen and tried to highlight things with the mouse cursor, nothing was showing up as clickable, so I assumed that this was just one of the many various quote-unquote interactive things I simply wasn't able to actually interact with, because there's actually quite a few of those in this game. Now, after a ton of mucking around and getting nowhere, I took another look at this and again tried clicking on random things until I suddenly saw something move, because my mouse motions just happened to cause a click and drag situation, which is when I realized I could click and drag these bones despite the fact the mouse does not indicate that the bones can even be interacted with. I think hands down the worst example of how badly made most of the puzzles are, though, is this one. In this room is a panel that you have to hold down, but first you have to even figure out that there is a panel, which you can't do with the mouse cursor. The panel can only be highlighted while it's already held down, and until then, the game won't do anything to tell you where it is. Now that in and of itself is pretty dumb, since this is fairly far into the game, and there's absolutely no precedent set for this kind of puzzle mechanic up to this point. So to expect the player to want to walk onto something with no indication that walking on it will produce an effect, it's kind of stupid in its own right. But once you do find the panel, guess how you hold it down? I looked through my inventory and nothing in there should have been heavy enough to...
That should hold it.
A rod. You hold down a solid freaking stone panel which took the weight of a person to move and wouldn't even illuminate the mouse cursor with a small metal rod. Yeah, once I hit this point of the game, I just said screw it and started using a walkthrough. Literally 80% of my footage up to this point is just me stumbling, trying to figure out how the mechanics of the various puzzles even work, because the game is incredibly unhelpful when it comes to trying to figure any of them out, or even just figuring out when there's a puzzle, as the game's incredibly secretive about what you should even be doing. I'm all for puzzles in games, but when I don't even know what the puzzle is, it stops being a test of my intelligence and instead becomes a test of my patience. Oh yeah, and some of the puzzles require timing too, or holding the mouse button down as opposed to just clicking. Or clicking through long sequences of symbols, which takes freaking forever because each symbol has 15 different states. You can only cycle them in one direction. You don't even know which set of symbols you're supposed to be working with because there's no correlation between the object which tells you the sequence and which set of symbols you're supposed to apply it to, which helps even less when you end up having to do it 4 times in a row because your crappy luck has you selecting all the wrong symbol sets at first and selecting the proper one last, by which point you're questioning if you're even doing it right. Also, this game has an enormous amount of backtracking and a really slow walking speed, just to add in little insult to injury given the insane amount of backtracking required.
Why didn't it work?
Again, I have mixed feelings on this one. The graphics and music are superb. The overall gameplay and story are not. And this is the kind of game where you pretty much have to be an adventure gaming expert to have any chance of success without a walkthrough, and without taking an exorbitant amount of your time in the first run through it, since so much of the progress in this game depends on thinking outside of the box as far as the demonstrated mechanics are concerned. The player-hostile approach of hiding puzzle mechanics behind expectations set by the game engine means success depends on someone being able to realize, I can do more than what the game expects me to do. And to me, that is not the mark of good game design. Several of the puzzles in this game would have been a lot easier to figure out while still being challenging if they actually had some kind of lead-in as to how they worked, or simply had more interactivity, or simply showed the player where the interactivity was instead of making the player think that interactivity will always be marked by a blue cursor highlight. Also, it should be noted that most of the challenge with the puzzles has nothing to do with your inventory. In fact, this game teeters very close to being more of a puzzle game than an inventory-based adventure, as most of the inventory-based puzzles are pretty simple, despite requiring objects which have little relation to the real world. Yep, just leave cycle set to auto and this game will run perfectly fine in DOSBox. However, if you've downloaded the Steam release, you're going to find getting it working in DOSBox isn't quite so easy. In fact, the Steam release doesn't work in ScumVM either. The reason for this is because the Steam release includes its own special engine for running the game, and for whatever reason, someone at some point decided to internalize one of the files normally present into this custom executable. This means that even though the Steam release includes every other file necessary for running the game in DOS or through ScumVM, without the internalized file being its own separate thing, it just doesn't work. Fortunately, with a little hex editing, you can simply copy the internalized file straight out of the executable and save it as its own separate file, completely restoring DOS and ScumVM support. Now, I'm not going to go over how to use hex editors or which one you should use to do this, as everyone's going to have their own opinions here. But what you want to do is open the game properties in Steam, browse the local files for the game, and open the file thedig.exe in your hex editor of choice. Now in your editor, move your cursor to decimal offset 340,632, or if you're using hex offsets, 53,298. Then simply highlight 16,304 bytes from that spot forwards, copy and paste it into its own file, and save the new file as dig.la0, making sure to place it inside the dig folder where the dig.la1 file can also be found. Yeah, dig.la0 is much smaller than dig.la1. But that's all you gotta do. This one step restores the missing file and allows the game to run in DOS and in ScumVM. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. I do have a backlog of gifted games to get to, but I still have to get some archiving done so I don't mess up which games came from who. So for episode 202, coming out on Saturday, January 14th, I'm going to be taking a look at an FMV action game which has several methods of transportation. Now, if you think you know of a game like that, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned because Season 5 is only just getting started. Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small sample of you guys.